Well, there, here, this. Hello, welcome to some Derps Talk About Games. I'm your co-host, Mango.
And I am your co-host, Buddy.
Today we're going to talk a little bit about roguelites and roguelikes and whether the trend of roguelitifying everything is good or not. And before we do that, buddy, I want to tell the folks at home what it is we do on this podcast.
On this podcast, we like to talk about games. So I titled this episode Roguelitification, which is just like I I guess it's sort of one of three things that I think is sort of happening in the industry right now, and we can maybe do follow-up episodes on the other two. And I can even preview that for that because I've had these thoughts in my brain actually for like the last 6 months. But roguelitification, in my opinion, is the kind of widespread adoption of these roguelike elements into conventionally very different gaming genres in order to kind of change the way that players approach the overall, I guess I would say, approach the overall product. And as a preface for this, I want to mention that I think we saw essentially this exact same process happen, which was probably 15 years ago, maybe in sort of like the late aughts. We had RPGification, right?
Hmm.
Where leveling up, leveling up and choosing bonuses, right? All of this stuff infected everything, right? At this point has sort of killed the genre term, in my opinion, of an RPG, right? RPGs are so ubiquitous, they're so in everything, they mean so many different things at this point that functionally speaking, an RPG doesn't exist anymore. It is just so deeply ingrained with gaming in kind of the same way that like Soviet montage was a genre in filmmaking that later became kind of so ubiquitous and co-opted as a filmmaking technique that it just became a fundamental aspect of filmmaking, right? Like an option that one could use when making a film. Does that make sense?
It does. I might quibble a little bit with about how useless the term RPG is because, like, this is a thing that we could probably do a whole episode on, which is like the connotation is stronger than the denotation, right? Like
Sure.
action, this is like the action adventure argument, right? Like,
Yeah.
when you say an action adventure game, if you are an enthusiast, you know what that means, even though, like, at some level, many games are action/adventure games. If you took the literal meaning of the word, I think RPG still kind of has a uh, a connotation to it that still holds weight. I think maybe you'd specify it usually a little bit more here with either J or C in front of it. Um,
Yeah, so I would agree that maybe what I'm really going for is that it has become less a genre and more of a super genre, right?
okay,
Which is it isn't that there is no way to make an RPG without participating in that level of subclassification, right? You can have an open world RPG, Starfield, right? You can have a JRPG, Sea of Stars, right? Or Octopath Traveler 2 would probably be a better recent
oh
example.
yeah,
You can have a CRPG, Baldur's Gate, right?
right.
And these are all fundamentally dissimilar games, even though they are all kind of in this sort of like movement of
Yeah, no, I mean, and we could talk about,
RPG.
like, like they all kind of come out of the, I would almost say, TTRPG like tradition, or like that's kind of like the base inspiration in a lot of ways, which
Yeah,
which
I
is fundamentally different than, like, the RPG elements you see in, say, a Call of Duty, right?
sure.
Um, but
Yeah,
yes,
so really, I use the word movement there, which I actually think is my favorite term for
okay,
this, which is to say a movement in traditional art, like visual art, right? You might have the expressionist movement, right? Like German expressionism is a movement of art, right? You can have a variety of different kind of subgenres of painting,
sure,
portraits, landscapes, still lifes, right? Those are all genres of painting, but they are part of the movement, we would say, of expressionism or impressionism or whatever other sort
sure.
of, you know, movement we're examining at a particular time. I think that's the best term for RPG because it matches this kind of overarching into subgenre thing. Though we
Right.
obviously this is without the kind of connotation of like historiography. Movements are viewed historiographically in art history because like they came and went by time period. I'm not suggesting something kind of along those lines. I just mean to say that like RPG is bigger than the genre that it once was, maybe however many years ago,
Yeah.
right?
No, I think that's fair.
Okay. Anyway, and bringing this forward, I feel like roguelikes are going through a similar thing right now, um, as well as a couple of other stuff. But I guess I won't get into that because it's outside of the scope of this podcast.
Why don't you drop the other two things and we'll bookmark them for future
Okay,
episodes.
one of them is less about genre and more about industry, but it's also about genre. It's what I would call the indification,
Okay.
of things that's happening. The best way I could possibly describe this would be the collapse of maybe a tactical strategy games like XCOM. I was thinking about this because I was playing XCOM. XCOM was a big AAA release that came out of 2K Games, right? With this like IP, it had two huge hits, right? But the third game in the series didn't sell, right? XCOM Chimera War, I think is what they call
Chimera
it, something like
Squad.
that. Chimera Squad, yeah, exactly. Um, what happened though is that XCOM created this genre and then it built up an audience for that genre, and that audience followed kind of high profile developers in the genre into the indie space, right? A similar thing is happening right now with Stormgate, right? You had StarCraft 2 seasons of development. Those developers go and they start Frost Giant Studios. Now they're making Stormgate, right? Like their big RTS. They just had a big like show match or whatever. This is indification in action, right? Which is that like the trail is sort of blazed on the top end by AAA games, right? And then indies come in and sort of flood the like kind of the lower level enthusiast market. And the only way that like a AAA game can compete really with that kind of thing is with like scale and scope. Like this is like I said, this is another
Oh
story
no,
for
I
another
would say
day.
that's a whole other podcast, but that's super interesting. I would have,
But yeah, so I think that's happening.
I would have initially thought that what you meant was like, it's like I think Dave the Diver is like this big indie game. Like I think that's like published by Nexon and had like hundreds of people work on it or something like that, right?
Oh
Like,
yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I have lots of we could get into that, I guess later.
yeah,
I have
that's
lots
another
of
thing
very
too.
complicated thoughts about those. Yeah, but then the other one is, I guess you call it Souls-likeification, right? Which is the kind of widespread adoption of Souls-like elements. This one is very similar to like the roguelite stuff.
Right.
Um, honestly, some of a good example of both indification and Souls-likeification would be, Souls like themselves coming into stuff like Grime or whatever. Um, there's a million of these blasphemous Death's Gambit, right? Like these are all Souls like, these are like indie Souls likes, but they are combining Souls like with other genres, right? Grime combines it with Metroidvania, or I actually I commented on how it felt like there were now Souls-like elements in an Assassin's Creed game, right? I think that a lot of the things that people identify as being like broadly Souls-like are now sort of falling into other into other genres as
So
well.
yeah, I think that's interesting. I also think there's a thing there that also is happening with roguelites. We had an episode way back about the Berlin definition of a roguelike, which is essentially
Okay.
like, a roguelike is only a roguelike if it's from the rogue region of likeness, right? Otherwise, it's just sparkling, sparkling, procedurally generated content or whatever, right? But like, the people who wrote the definition were very serious about it, right? Um, uh, and so, but like part of, and I think the less extreme version of that argument is that like, as kind of the lightness or like the kind of aspects spread, they also get diluted and maybe things get called it because they have like a couple of video, like, the old joke for Souls likes, right, is like it has a dodge roll, so I guess it counts, or it's hard, right? Like, it's like the joke is like, is that really enough to qualify it as a Souls like? And I think similar things happen with with roguelikes, which focus of this episode. The interesting thing here is the reason that this popped into my head was this week I have played it's before the storm or against the
Against the
storm,
Storm. Yeah.
which is a roguelite town builder, and RoboQuest, which is a roguelite first person shooter, and kind of in the style of Borderlands. Um, and that was just interesting to me because they were the two genres that I hadn't really seen super represented. Right, we've seen a lot of third person shootery roguelites, um, uh, and but like both of them stray pretty far, not only from kind of like the very traditional definition of a roguelike, which is like this kind of quasi turn-based RPG thing with arcane rules that you don't understand, but also kind of like I think the sharper edges of that, which is something like um you know uh like essentially there's a meta progression in both of these games that like, and meta progression is kind of I think one of the bigger sticking points about like how much of a roguelike are you really, right? Because the game expects you to make meta progression to actually beat the game, whereas like in a more traditional format, if there's meta progression at all, it's just kind of like potential unlocks for runs. Um, and you only truly beat the game if you beat it top to bottom, uh, on your own. And it's just kind of like your mastery that is built and some of the options you can pick up, but they're not necessarily strictly better. And like, it's not like you're bringing that power into the run. It just kind of, it's kind of, it's just unlocked for you along the way. Um, uh,
Yeah, the word that I like for describing that is that I guess I want to say at the core of a roguelike gaming experience, in my opinion, you have um possibility. You're exploring the possibility space, right? Which is different than sort of like a linear sort of experience where it's just bop 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 bop, right? All set
Battery
up and
low.
kind of in a row, essentially. Um, I think, and I don't think this is how people like typically conceive of roguelikes, right? Like when I think people think of roguelikes, they're thinking of sessions, right? They think of
Charging
them in two
battery.
sessions. You have your runs, right? Um, but the true experience of a roguelike is the sort of sum total of knowledge, that mastery that you get over the course of all of the runs. That is sort of like the total experience, which I think is complicated because like when I play Estrella now, right? Not that I want to say I've personally mastered Estrella, even though I guess actually by most metrics I have personally mastered Estrella, right? When I play Estrella now, I know the builds and I know the strategies and I know the enemies before I even sit there, right? Or before I even hit them, and that comes out of hours and hours and hours of exploring the possibility space, right? I've just played enough of the game end over end to get to this point, I guess, where not that I can sort of like predict everything, but I have that sort of total mastery over what the game has to offer and how it offers it, right? Um, and I think this is kind of like the totality of that like roguelike experience, I guess. When looking at, I don't know, this stuff.
Yeah, no, that makes an amount of sense to me. Um, yeah, no, I generally vibe with that. Um, the only other thing that kind of popped into my head here is that roguelites also have a level of iterability. Is maybe the
Mm.
way to put it. That like because like I was thinking about this specifically with Against the Storm, right? Because Against the Storm is your kind of like, I would say, RimWorld style or like Dwarf Fortress style town builder, but like it's bite-sized chunks. Um, because you could like, if you're using a very expansive definition of roguelite, you might describe Dwarf Fortress or RimWorld or even like Minecraft kind of as having roguelike elements, right? Because the world is procedurally generated with each start, right? If you're playing the survival mode, especially with like Dwarf Fortress um or RimWorld, right? Like something can happen to kill your run. It doesn't have as much of an explicit fail state, or sometimes it does, right? Or like even like Factorio, right? Like they're like each,
Solaris, right?
yeah,
You could say, 4X games are roguelikes under those sort. I would actually say that weirdly, 4X games are, I don't know. I hadn't thought about it in those sorts of terms
yeah,
until right this moment, but they're very roguelike, actually.
yeah. So and I think the distinction there, and this is the problem, is that it's kind of fuzzy, is that it's supposed to be sessionable, I guess, is the way to put it,
Mhm.
right? Like, the thing that keeps them from being considered as roguelikes is the length of their single play session before you hit that reset point. Um
Oh, interesting. So it's like 45 minutes or an hour or something like that.
I that even gets a little bit long, I think, for like some, right? I'm like, or like the successful run is 45 minutes to an hour. I think part of it too is that like with something like a 4X game, you're probably not going to lose until like pretty far into the game, right? Like like a 4X game, you're not gonna like it generally you're not going to lose before the end game, right? And you will
Okay.
lose and you can lose in the end game, but that's like an end game condition, whereas like in a roguelite you will lose somewhere along the way. Which is maybe something that gets bent here, right? Because like I feel like Against the Storm gives you a lot of room to play with before you actually absolutely fail out. Have you played Against the Storm?
I've not played Against the Storm. I know about it. I got it for Rachel. She played a bunch of
Okay.
it. She really loves these city builder games. This is really interesting, and I don't have a great uh I don't know that I have a great answer to like what's the difference between a 4X game and a roguelike. Because I kind of think that the session thing, I would say that's fungible. You know what I mean? Um
See, I think that that's going to be a thing that people are going to instinctively balk against, right? Like maybe you can, this is like the pornography question, right? Like I know it when I see it, right? Like, and I
mhm.
think the length is going to put it out of like I know it when I see it, and that's not it, right? For like a 4X game. Um,
Yeah, man, that's really complicated. I want to say that it's like part of this is just like the raw trouble of definitions,
right?
right?
Yeah, yeah.
Like actually sitting down and defining things is really hard. It's like the, what is a chair tweet from that one guy. And then it's like, uh I don't know that I think a 4X game definitely has roguelike elements, but I don't think it has enough of those elements to be considered roguelike. But also, I don't know that I could sit it down and explain the different, like the difference. Um,
Right. I mean, I could imagine. See, and maybe I'm just like pointing to the thing that like if you designed a roguelite 4X game, right? Like I think the primary thing people would be looking for would be like a shorter version of that 4X experience that you play like a handful of times, right? Like um maybe FTL.
Honestly, weirdly, meta progression might be a part of it. Meta progression is
Yeah.
considered to be the thing that differentiates a roguelike and a roguelite, right?
Generally,
Um,
yeah. I mean again, this is
yeah,
definition
like
stuff.
not that I want to like get in the weeds on like these semantics or whatever, but just generally, right? And it's very uncommon for 4X games to have meta progression along those sorts of levels. And I also think that 4X games even if hmm, it's I don't think that 4X games fulfill my explore the possibility space mastery curve that I'm kind of trying to sort of like lay out, right? Like I know the world of Total War really well and to like Total War Warhammer 3, right? Or I understand the mechanics of Stellaris insanely well, right? So I'm probably a really high end, Warhammer or Stellaris player just by like on volume, right? Like top 20% or something like that. Um, but I don't think that I got the mastery that I did because of the repetition of failed runs. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Which is maybe like a piece of the roguelike experience. Like roguelikes are kind of metaphorically charting a path through the woods. You are exploring a forest And every day you get to go into the forest until a bear eats you, let's say, right? The bear being your failure, or even sometimes your success, right? You just, you can't explore the whole thing. You can't explore the whole thing in just kind of like one playthrough.
Right, and there's like
Um,
usually an expectation of kind of randomness and like and information hiding too, right? Like like aren't if you pick up an item in a typical roguelite, then you aren't expected to know what it is without an external source, right? It's not expected to
right.
be in the game, type of deal.
And even for a roguelike, like, so for instance, for Estrella, just because it's the easiest
Yeah,
option, even starting a run with a character is wildly different to the decision of starting like a campaign in Total War, right?
yeah,
A campaign in Total War, by definition, is very set in stone on what your goals are and like what you can accomplish, right? Because you know, Total War is a little bit different because like the world is procedurally generated in the sense that different factions will win or lose battles, but everybody starts in the exact same spot every time, right?
sure,
And so when you get to Ulthuan, maybe the Dark Elves have taken control of Ulthuan. Maybe the High Elves have remained in control of Ulthuan. Maybe Nakari has gone crazy and Slanesh owns all of like Ulthuan. Those are sort of random, sort of procedurally generated, right? But it's not like reaching Ulthuan, as an empire, will be very different, right? If I'm playing Bretonia, if I'm playing, you know, God, Couronne, right? The King Luin Leoncoeur, right? King of Bretonia, right?
sure.
I have unlocked essentially all of his power just in that one tiny choice. A roguelike, in my opinion, I think, and this is the core thing that I think would say this is the difference between a roguelike and a 4X game. You don't make too many choices over the course of playing Bretonia where you are opting into a radically different build for this empire. Do you know what I mean? Um, I
You,
feel like when you're in a strategy game, you are kind of
I don't.
man, I
I
I
would
feel
say
like I'm
because I feel
insane
something like
structurally.
I think Warhammer is maybe the wrong game for that comparison, right? Because like the Total
Well,
War
but even
series,
Stellaris, right? Like Stellaris, I think would also fit this, which is also completely randomly generated, right, and
right?
all this other sort of stuff. If I'm playing a mega corporation, I have a definitive path to victory, and the only way I'm going to be able to make that work is if I pursue it in sort of from minute one that path, right? Yeah, I can't play a mega corporation and then halfway through my run get a new, I don't know, something that makes me go, "Oh, I'm gonna destroy all my branch offices," right? You like that's not
Yeah,
like common or possible or
sure.
something that one
But
would
like
do.
I think maybe the more central skill would be something like Civ, where you absolutely can like choose to play tall or play wide, and your civilization influences that, right? Or like pursue a culture versus a military victory, and
Oh yeah, or like a religious victory.
yeah, your
Yeah.
civilizations will push in that direction. Um, but um, I think there's a mix of things here that we could probably like spend the whole episode defining, but I
Sure.
think
Yeah.
maybe that's not what we wanted to focus on. I think it's more kind of on
Fair
like
enough.
this trend of like shoving roguelite elements. And I think part of that is just kind of like little pieces that are identifiably roguelite. Like, I think Against the Storm fails a lot of like typical roguelite criteria, but
Hmm.
it's clearly meant to be a a roguelite, right? It's described that way by everybody that I've seen talk about it, right? And I think that's down to short session time. I'm not saying that that's like a requirement for every roguelite or whatever, since that came up before, but like I think that's part of the thing, right? Like a a typical rogue or a typical city builder is one session that you play for, or it's one thing that you play for a very, 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 very long time. And if it fails, it's kind of like a fail state of like, it's like, okay, I'm actually restarting the game and there's nothing else there, right? To your point, maybe a little bit of meta progression stuff builds it in. I don't know. This is maybe like weird Ship of Theseus stuff, right? Like meta progression
Hmm.
isn't isn't part of Rogue or NetHack like the originals, right? Um, but it is kind of the thing that makes this city builder bit feel more roguelite is that there is a meta progression element when you because at the end of an Against the Storm run, even if you succeed, you have to you end the run and you go back out and you do a meta progression thing, right? Like you
Mm.
build the town. Essentially, the mission is one almost in kind of like an old school RTS way, right? And then you go build another town, and then at some point the storm comes and it wipes away all your meta progress. But you get to keep the resources you've gathered, and you can like upgrade some things that will help you on your next run, right? And that meta progression isn't that meta progression, and also that kind of like successful runs that lead to more meta progression that aren't like true successes, right? That's not all part, like that is like none of that is the core or NetHack experience, but is so much part of the roguelite culture that gets identified with, which is like just a weird thing to kind of uh hit on. And I think part of the reason, like I wanted to talk about and identify some of the reasons that this mode is is being added to a bunch of different game types. I think like you maybe even could arguably call battle royales roguelites, or like a sibling genre, maybe is the way to put it.
I think I would say battle royales are roguelikes. They are like roguelikes. I think they are. It's complicated. Does roguelike include a single player connotation? Because I think if yes, battle royale is no, but if no, then battle royale is yes. Do you see
Yeah,
what I'm
I mean,
saying?
I think it might include a a non PvP connotation.
Okay.
But like maybe, right? Like, but like that's like that's yeah, I guess, because like then you get into weird spaces where like is Super Smash Brothers with items on a roguelite, right? Like, um, uh, but
So the thing that I think make a battle royale a roguelike is uh the nature of this would be an interesting point somebody could quibble on. The nature of the map is random because the circle. The map itself is static,
yeah,
but this is sort of like I was describing with like Total War. The process is functionally random because wherever the circle is radically redefines how the map looks. In the same way that whatever civilizations in Total War end up conquering Ulthuan radically redefine how you approach conquering Ulthuan as like a player character, right? So I think part of my thing with all this, really, with Rogue, with like roguelike as sort of like a genre, um, does definitely come down to um Man, yeah, God, that actually thinking about it, it's like this is such a rabbit hole to like go down. My brain is like melting out of my ears thinking about it because I think it's the random items, which definitely
yeah,
matters, right? You know, you walk in with a different sort of like loadout every time, and over the course of the progression, right, you might pick up like really good stuff, like your scope, and you get a sniper rifle. Now you're sniping, or you get a shotgun and heavy armor, and now you're really trying to like close quarters or something like that. Look, I think all that stuff matters when it comes to like like a battle royale. And then like does it count the thing I'm thinking about is does it count that Fortnite changes its map all the time? Do you know what I mean?
yeah,
Um Fortnite is a better example of this than I think like Warzone or something, because to my knowledge there's nothing static in the Warzone map like items wise. Um but Fortnite will do stuff like that, right? Like where it will put choice stuff in items like I'm thinking of one example. Not that I've ever played Fortnite, but I'm thinking of one example I saw in a YouTube video where a guy talked about how there's a mini quest essentially that you can do in Fortnite where you're in the actual game Fortnite, the circle is closing, you're doing all this other sort of stuff, but you can go around the map, you can pick up key cards in random locations to unlock a vault, which is also in a random location that has just like the Giganuts stuff, right? That's sort of a roguelike element to it in a way. Do you know what I mean?
yeah.
Because like all that stuff is like random and
Randomized
you can be going,
objectives. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
yeah. Like that, yeah. And like your path through the map matters because you're now hunting for these key cards, rather than, or it might not be key cards, it might just like be keys or whatever.
yeah.
That like feels like me charting my path on Estrella, right? Up the thing, or in Slay the Spire and whatever other sort of like rogue, kind of scenario that you're in.
Yeah. And I think it is ultimately unimportant how closely we tie these two together. Because I think the thing the thing that's common about them that I think drives kind of like the roguelitification of a lot of genres these days is essentially like this because the thing we talked about with battle royales is the reduction of the frustration factor, right? At the end of the day, if you have like if you are playing say RimWorld, right, for like 30 hours your world and then something goes to shit, it feels kind of terrible, right? And like maybe you've got like a backup save that you can revert to. Still feels kind
Sure.
of bad. But like in a roguelite or like in something like Against the Storm, if you fail, that's kind of fine because you just go start another city anyway, and you were never expecting that city to go for 30 hours, right?
Yeah.
Like, and I think that's part of the thing that's being harnessed here, along with kind of like from like a very kind of, you know, mercenary perspective. It's a way to kind of like get a lot of mileage out of content without having to, you know, worry, and also being able to kind of like the procedural dish lets you build a little bit focus more, I guess, on systems than on narrative design, if that makes sense, and like pure level design,
Okay.
maybe.
So I find that really interesting. It feels to me, I haven't played Against the Storm, but I'm just interested in your like city builder experience. I talked a lot about Anno 1800, which is maybe the
Yeah,
biggest city builder I've been playing recently. Are you familiar with like the Anno series?
not really, actually.
Okay. Maybe it's a bad example then. The Anno series is like Anno 1800, Anno
Yeah,
1602, Anno 2275 or something, right? And it's just like different time periods. But like the Anno 1602 is about like colonization and
sure.
like you are a Renaissance colonial power, setting up colonies. 1800 is also quite like that, but it's also built around the Industrial Revolution. You're building factories. You're kind of like modernizing your sort of society. And obviously 2275 is like future bullshit. You go to the moon in 2275. You're harvesting moon gas. um, the I feel like the point of that genre is maybe I would call it grandiosity,
Sure.
or maybe grandiosity is like a good version of it. Which I think to me this is crossed. These are mechanics that are at or sort of design goals that are at odds with one another. Right. The city builder wants you to build endlessly to make the most glorious, gigantic, perfectly assembled empire city, whatever, that you possibly can assemble, right? The roguelike wants you to tear that down
Yes.
frequently.
Yes.
That's complicated.
Yes. Um, I think the way it gets away with it is by focusing more on exploration as an aspect than on some of like the more automation-y focused stuff, right? Like, um, I have not played any of like the super deep things yet. I only played a couple of the few of the opening missions, but like basically, so the kind of frame is that you are a uh, uh, like a duke essentially of the Scorched Queen, who's like the world is covered in a storm. The storm wipes away everything every once in a while, and there's one bastion against it. This is the realm of the Scorched Queen, and you are one of her dukes or like viscounts or something like that. That is like leads these like villages, and the villages collect resources, and that resource collection um, gets wiped away eventually. That's part of what you're trying to prevent. Or that's like essentially the meta progression, right? Is you are trying to build up enough fortifications that you can resist a storm more and more. But the kind of mechanic in the game is like you do these micro objectives, and then that rewards you with the queen's favor, and the queen's favor grants you unlocks. And my understanding is those unlocks per session, per like town, are randomized. Um, and because they are randomized, your town looks slightly different each time. And there's also this aspect of like one of the resources is woods, and you're like generally in like a small area to start, and your wood cutting exposes more areas of the map. Um, and there are things in kind of like in the holes between the trees There are things to explore. Like there are things there, like little bonuses, sometimes things that are dangerous, right? And you are essentially trying to get the to a certain level of development before the queen gets basically loses her patience with you and recalls you. You're trying to uh, finish the town and leave it in a finished state. And then you leave it in a finished state until the storm comes around and wipes everything out again, and then you have to rebuild essentially.
Okay. Yeah, that's really complicated. I have played stuff similar to this from time to time. In fact, you know what? I'm not gonna go there. You know, but man, it's really crazy to me that like it's about sort of building a bunch of iterative small towns that don't last. Like, when I think of city builders, I think of lasting.
Yeah, no, I think the reason it works is, have you ever played like a dwarf fortress or like a rim world and like had something go wrong and been like, you know what, fuck this. I don't like essentially I don't quite understand this yet. I'm going to try again, right? And you just like load up a new thing and go through that beginning part all over again.
Hmm.
It's kind of like
Yeah, but
that.
I do want to say that I feel like that's common outside of roguelikes. I do that on Iron. I've done that today, like 4 times, starting Iron Man XCOM 2 games. Where if my first mission or two goes pretty badly, I'll just start over, right? Which is like I wouldn't say that an Iron Man strategy game like this, but like that happens to me in Solaris. That happens to me in
So I would
Total War. Like I'll do that in so
right
many
right right
things.
right. But I think the thing that Against the Storm is capturing is that kind of and like gamifying it, that specific reiteration process, right? Like instead of like restarting the game until you get like a good start and you jump deep into it, it just kind of like is always on that track, right? Like if your favorite part of the game is the initial setup piece, it's mostly going to be about that. And I think the game does crescendo to bigger and bigger building, longer missions that like have you building out more and more of it. But it's more iterative than it's like explicitly iterative as part of the mechanics of the game, which includes the meta progression, as opposed to just kind of like part of the meta game, which is what it is in kind of these Iron Man things. It's interesting you bring up the Iron Man version of XCOM because like I think if XCOM was just the Iron Man mode, we'd say that was pretty roguelike. It's just the fact that Iron Man's an optional version of XCOM rather than the designed version of XCOM that we don't. Um, Presumably, you'd also design XCOM slightly differently if Iron Man was the primary mode, right? Like you'd make things.
So the part of this is that I'm it's so early that I can restart without any pain. You
Right.
know what I mean? Um, which maybe does speak to the length thing that you're talking about, the sessionization of it.
Yeah.
As I sort of disputed this at first, but I maybe undispute this now. Because when I think about playing my campaign, I do think about it in terms of sessions, right? I sit down, I load up the campaign, I continue playing it, right? For however long, 45 minutes, an hour, 3 hours, right? But I'm never really in a position where I want to restart my 20-hour campaign. I can restart after 45 minutes after 2 bad runs or like 2 bad opening missions because redoing 45 minutes is not painful. It's painful, I think, to do um it's really painful to be honest. It's painful, I think, to redo a grand strategy game when you're in the deep late game, right? In a Stellaris run, when you're fighting the crisis, nobody wants to start the Iron Man game over again because they made a minor mistake, because that's undoing 60 hours of game time, that kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. Um, and so I think Against the Storm tries to kind of harness that.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's also possible if you played it, you would not have as much fun with it.
I think I would like it, and here's why. I think this is a Total War thing too. Grandiosity isn't always what matters, and maybe you could get invested in the meta progression. So something I'm thinking about is in Total War. there are races who are big builders, right? If you play the dwarves, right? I'm sorry, the dwarfs. If you play the dwarfs in Total War,
The dwarfs.
you are in for they are not dwarves in Warhammer, they are dwarfs. If
Dwarfs.
you are
No
playing
W either. Just
yeah,
DORF.
yeah. Yeah, yeah. Listen, if you're playing the Karazhan Corps, okay, that's what they're called. Okay. If you're playing the dwarfs in Total War Warhammer 3, you are committing yourself to sort of a grandiose sort of play style, right? But if you're playing chaos, you're not. Right, like the Warriors of Chaos have sort of big cities that they build up as bastions, but they also build up outposts, right? Or actually, Norska might be a really good example of this. Norska can build up on coastal towns. They can build up sort of these raiding outposts, and they're very cheap cities that grow extremely quickly that you can kind of cap out pretty soon. And the idea is you're creating a little base for yourself as you're going on your raiding expeditions, right? Like this is sort of like the lore, the flavor, right? You are Wolfric the Wanderer. You show up on the shores of the Empire. You take over a coastal town. You take over Gorsel or something like Norden or some shit like that. You make that shit a port city, like this like outpost that gives you a bunch of replenishment in allied territories, all this other sort of stuff. You fight, and then once you have sacked all of the towns in the surrounding area, you've looted all of that wealth. You then leave through your port and go do something else, right? And then when the guys come and they show up and they destroy your port, that's not a big deal. I don't care, right? When the Empire takes back that territory, because the point of my Norska run is I'm not looking for territorial expansion. I am looking to show up to big, expensive, grandiose cities and loot them for all the gold that they're worth because I'm fighting for the favor of the dark gods, right? Like this kind of thing. And and that's just like one of like a dozen different kinds of like play style
Sure.
examples, right? Obviously when you're playing as dark elves, you're going for grandiosity, right? Like dark elves want to consolidate, they want to build big grandiose cities, but they also want to do a lot of looting and raiding because they need slaves in order to fuel those cities, right? Same thing with the dark not the dark iron dwarves are the craft version. Same thing with the Chaos Dwarfs, right? They need to do a lot of raiding and slaving and stuff like that because like their cities are built on or built on slavery. And I feel like maybe Against the Storm is tapping into that a little bit, right? Where it's not about building up, your big giant city that is going to dominate whatever. It's about building an outpost that's going to survive a little bit, but ultimately gonna get consumed. And you're fine with that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. No, it
Yeah.
it, it absolutely does. Um, but do you have thoughts on like why roguelitification? Because like we talked a lot about Against the Storm, but like RoboQuest is you know much more like it's much less controversial, right? Like you can imagine it's doing like Borderlands, like doing a dungeon or like doing a dungeon in like Diablo, except you reset your character at the beginning of the dungeon instead of at the beginning of the season, right? Like, um, this
Yeah, I think part of that. What do I think? Hmm. I think part of that it kind of comes into the approach that I don't know. So here's sort of where my brain is going with with like this side of things. In first person shooters, um, I feel like you can have the variety. You get this big variety of gameplay, which is what's satisfying which is like a piece of what's satisfying about like roguelike elements. So, for instance, in like man, I don't actually have like a really great example for like something that's similar. Maybe Doom. Oh God, Jesus Christ! Am I really gonna go to Doom? Whatever, fine. We'll be that podcast. In Doom, you have certain levels that are about like ammo conservation, and certain levels that are about like using the fun guns, right? If you get a bunch of ammo for the BFG and you're taking down cyber demons, that is a way that you play Doom and that's fun, right? Then you have other sorts of levels where it's just about like your pistol and your shotgun, right? And can you manage incoming projectiles, all this other sort of stuff, just with that, just like with the pistol and a shotgun. I feel like what a first-person shooter roguelike is doing is tapping into that sort of level of sort of variety and fun, but poured it into, or but using procedural generation in order to expand the experience, right? Where it's not that the level is designed meticulously by like whatever John Carmack, is it Romero?
I
Is it
think
both of them?
I think the original one
Is
was
it
both of them. Yeah, I think that's
okay?
the two Johns. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that is the two Johns. Where John Romero and John Carmack are making like meticulously designed like levels that are built to give you this sort of variety. Instead, you're just going to use procedural generation to give you variety. And so when you walk into the experience, you are walking into the experience knowing that you could end up doing shotguns, you could end up doing BFG, you could end up doing pistol stuff based on what you end up picking up and getting over the course of the run. Does that make sense?
Yes. No,
Okay.
it absolutely does, and I feel like that's probably maybe the through line here, right? Is like there are a lot of games that have those kinds of elements to them, and that roguelites try and like bring out those specific elements at kind of the expense of like a more kind of like a more crafted experience type of deal, right? Does that sound
Mhm.
about right to you?
Yeah, I have also never seen RoboQuest before, but now that I'm like looking at it,
It's super
it
fun.
is very Borderlands, huh?
Yeah. So the visual style is very Borderlands, but it plays almost like almost like a boomer shooter, right? Like
Mm.
very a lot of you can only hold two weapons, which is kind of
That's
against
like
that genre.
anti-murder shooter. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, but like it's like fast moving, jumping around a lot. It's maybe more like Quake, I guess, right? Like it's fast rather than kind of like
Oh, I definitely see the influence from like dodging, like because this is one of the core things of Doom is that offensive gameplay is very fast, the defensive gameplay is very slow, right? So you are moving fast and shooting fast, but the incoming fire is dodgeable, right? Because
yes,
the enemy are not using hit scan weapons, they're using projectile weapons, right? And so it's about sort of circle strafing, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, I feel that. Okay.
yeah. It's a very fun game.
How did you get pointed onto this game? I'm gonna you know what?
Um,
Let's put it on the wish list. Like
I
get played it.
think it was. I think maybe Adam Millard, he's a YouTuber, did like a top 20 games you didn't play in 2023. This
Okay.
is also where I found South Scrimshaw and Chance of Senar from the
Derpy award winning. Yeah.
yeah and also Against the Storm actually uh and Mosalina, which is funnily enough, I think a game that could fit in here. Mosalina is this weird little platformer type game where levels aren't quite randomly generated. The levels I think are out of a set, but like your character has like a set of like I think it's like 30 or so abilities they can use. The you get assigned like I think 5 for a run and 3 per an attempt, and the level just might not be completable with like your set, right? Like it's I think meant to be subversive, right? But like the idea is like here are these tools that are like vaguely useful for platforming. See if you can put them together to platform your way. Like it's basically like grab 3, or grab a couple of like points, and then once you hit those points, get to the exit type of deal. Um, and like one of the powers is like drop a box, right? And you can use that like 5 times, and like that's pretty useful. You can see how that works. One of them is a camera, and the camera freezes moving objects. Um, and like they all interact super interestingly, but like I said, the game's not necessarily completable. But it is kind of like in the genre of like explore the space, do what you want. It just doesn't have kind of like the same kind of through line that like it doesn't have any meta progression, and like the point is just kind of to play, right? So it's not quite there, but it's an interesting game idea. Um, I would actually recommend people go check that out too.
Okay. How do you feel about another like roguelike that I think is interesting in this sort of conversation is Vampire Survivors. How do you feel about
Ooh,
like Vampire Survivors? That's like in my opinion Vampire Survivors is a very true roguelike, right? Like, like this is, as kind of kind of close to roguelike as we have gotten recently. But the thing that I find interesting about it is that it is also innovative, right? It is a new take on the genre that is like wildly different,
Yeah,
that is now spawning its own spin-offs, right? Whisker Squadron Survivor is a good one that I played at Day of the Devs a couple of weeks ago. That one is Star Fox. You are Star Fox jet fighter, but you are getting Vampire Survivor sort of like updates and upgrades and all this other sort of stuff.
there's a HoloLive
I
one
saw
I know. It's like
Yeah,
free.
the one that I saw is called Time Survivors, which is you are playing as time traveling historical figures like Lincoln, Cleopatra, Nikola Tesla, but you are going back in time and fighting Romans as the random enemies, dinosaurs as the random enemies, that kind of thing. And I'm just interested in that.
Yeah, no, that's interesting because like my initial gut reaction is to push back against that as a roguelite, but I see what you're saying. Um, like I like the only thing I disagree with is that it's kind of like a core roguelite experience. Like I don't think it has enough of kind of like the usual connected pieces to like be that close to the core of it. Um,
Really? I feel like it satisfies so many of the conditions, right? What are the conditions that it doesn't satisfy, in your opinion?
um, typically it's too easy to win. I think is part of it, right? Like you aren't like there's not like there's not like a real I guess there's some meta progression, but like or like in most roguelikes, you are pushing towards a victory condition, right? That you don't get for a while because you are either not skilled enough in like your very traditional no meta progression or kind of like meta progressionist options game, right? Like a Enter the Gungeon or a Rogue or a Net Hack, or because you haven't built up enough meta progression to make that like feasible, which is a thing in like like I said, Against the Storm or in uh like Hades or Rogue Legacy, which I think is probably the most meta progression heavy game. You really can't beat that game, or you're not really expected to beat that game at base levels, right? Whereas Vampire Survivors is like eminently beatable pretty immediately, right? Like maybe you need like a run to get on your feet, but you will hit that 30-minute timer pretty quickly. Although maybe it's pushed itself more because I think the DLC has introduced like story mode or something, so like maybe it's more down that path. I don't think it's a bad comparison. It just doesn't feel very core to me. But that's more of a feeling than it is something that um, I can uh, super well justify. Maybe it's just because like when you play more rounds of Vampire Survivor, the thing you're optimizing is like your like insanity rather than and it's pretty easy to do that, right? Like the space is small enough that like there's also like not a, like you can force builds effectively in Vampire Survivors, right? Like pretty effectively. Um and like you can target things. Um
Okay. Yeah, because I guess, take enough time. You also have a lot of tools to deal with that, right?
yeah.
Um, Interesting. Yeah, I mean,
I,
I definitely would agree that I think Rogue Legacy is the most core rogue-like kind of experience, right?
so I would say that is the kind of like most progression gated roguelike experience, right? Like
Right.
um which
I'm
is
just thinking what satisfies, if we're thinking about roguelike as kind of like a map of things, and you need a certain collection of signifiers in order to constitute roguelike, the 4X has some of the signifiers, not enough, right? But Rogue Legacy has probably almost all of them.
so
Like
roguelike
I
it's interesting because Rogue Legacy has like this kind of like tier two signifiers that aren't part of the original set of signifiers, right? Like Rogue Legacy is probably the poorest rogue light if we bring back that distinction, right? Because like it has like the people who care about roguelike purity will say that Rogue Legacy is not a good rogue is not a roguelike at all because it is so tied to its meta progression, right? Um,
Okay. Sure. I mean, I think I would at this point say that those people are dumb and I don't know.
I,
To me, roguelike and roguelite are pretty fungible terms, and I'm kind of just like dealing with them as
yeah, I mean
a unit. But
they are they are useful distinctions insofar as you are talking about the specific type of game that is like a Dungeons of Dreadmore or a roguelike or a rogue or a net hack that is like,
mhm.
or even something that's more like, I think a little bit closer in the kind of like progression space, like Enter the Gungeon, but further away in kind, or even Astrea, right? Like Astrea, level 1 for each character gives you like the opening die and blessing, but that's like so core to the experience that's almost kind of like your first one's almost tutorial mode. Um, for each character rather than like because like you almost immediately hit level 1 where you get that kind of basic stuff, um but like you're not tied to your meta progression, right? Like that you unlock more options in Astray. You don't unlock more raw power but for that first level where you get the choice between the blessing and the dark blessing and the die, um which is like
Okay,
also
yeah.
arguably maybe not power, but that's like that's also a more nuanced discussion. But like I see your point there. But we mostly just like talked about the definition of roguelites for 55
Yeah,
minutes.
I guess okay, let's actually in the last 5 minutes talk about do you think this is a good or bad thing for like the genre, the industry, the community, right?
I think it's got kind of like the it's probably the same thing that that has always been like trends get chased, right? Like it'll be good for a while and then it'll get tired and then it'll fall apart. Um and
Oh, interesting. See, I would say absolutely this is a good thing. Mostly because I think getting out of sort of I mean, okay, I don't want to say that this thing is like fundamentally better, like one thing is fundamentally better than the other, but I think it's a reflection of the complex tastes and I don't know what desires of players, right? Actually, I'm sorry, to back this up. Okay. Do you know what the term overhead means? Like the game design. Have I
yes.
explained this on the podcast? Yeah.
Um
Just
I mean
you
it's
know,
a
our
general
listeners
thing,
won't know.
right? Like
Yeah.
yeah, explain it. Go for it.
Overhead describes the amount of knowledge required in order to perform at various levels in a game, right? So for instance, the overhead in World of Warcraft to complete the story quests very very low, right? Most people are going to be able to just like intuit the core mechanics, their rotation. They're not going to die, fighting these like story quests, right? Maybe the overhead for low level sort of like mythics or something like that, right? Or somebody who likes doing time walking. That's also pretty low, right? At the end of the day, there's not a lot of like progression there. But the overhead to mythic rating or pushing 20s, in like mythic plus, the overhead is very high. You need to understand the dungeons, how they work. How do you maximize the damage in your class? What are all of the different options for utility that you have on offer to you, right? Like all of that stuff. This is all overhead, right? Um Overhead is not a game neutral thing. One of the things that I've described about Civilization is I'm actually pretty bored with current iterations of Civilization, and that's because I bring in a lot of 4x overhead that is just like I kind of just like want more out of the title, right? I comprehend the basics on how to deal with the X game. So playing Civilization is boring because it doesn't really offer enough new stuff to really keep me
Right.
kind of engaged in
I
the way that Europa Universalis, the most overhead of overhead games, are like
right.
Hearts of Iron 4, right? Do keep me engaged, right? That process, I think, is happening in its sum total across all gamers constantly, right? Which is part of why we saw the folding of RPG elements into kind of mainline because people conceptually understand leveling up, they understand experience, right? They understand that as a sort of progression, and people generally speaking like it and had a pretty good time with it, right? Um I think a similar thing is happening with regards to the linear versus the sort of possibility space, right? As players are getting a more complex understanding of games as a wide cast net of ideas, right? roguelike elements make more and more sense to be brought into those games as design element, right? Um, and so insofar as I don't see this as trend chasing, right? In my mind, this is like fundamental. You now have people who have been growing up with video games like us, who are in our 30s. We've been doing this shit for 35 years, right? We understand. And we're looking for I don't know, just sort of like the next edge of content. And so that's this is why it's part of my overall thing, like Souls like identification, right? Like this is why it's part of this big package that I have been thinking about when it comes to games recently.
Interesting. See, I would take almost the, I don't think it's quite the polar opposite, but it is, I think, opposed in a way, which is I think this is kind of like almost like the TikTokification of video games, right? And I think there's like negative aspects to it, right? Like it's a, in some levels, a more shallow experience, right? Because like the things aren't as craftily crafted, and that's okay for certain types of games. But also like from like a kind of like very kind of like realistic thing, because we are 35-year-old, near 35-year-old adults, right? We don't have uh, you know, 72 hours in a week to dedicate to games anymore. And like, I want my first person shooter fix. I can get that in half an hour in RoboQuest, right? And I can get that a full kind of loop there without having to sit down for a long time. And not having to worry. Like in some senses, the overhead is lower, right? It's less overhead and more context, right? Like if like one of these big beautiful Doom levels, right? Like if I have to put the game down and go away for 2 weeks and come back, have I lost so much context that I don't know where I am anymore, right? Do I have to like either restart or backtrack just so I understand what I'm doing? RoboQuest, I put this down and come back in 2 weeks. Maybe I forget how some of this stuff works, but I can jump back in pretty quick and I don't have to worry about like really holding on to anything. I can kind of rediscover it over the course of a couple of runs. I don't think it's necessarily bad, right? Like I know, like calling it TikTokification maybe has negative connotation to it, but I don't think it's an unalloyed good either. I think it's like
Okay, sure. Here's my question. Do you think Borderlands is a more complex experience because it's crafted and it's built for a level progression, right? Than RoboQuest?
um, what was the specific question? Is it a more complex experience?
Right. Yes. Yeah. More
Um,
complex.
I think there are some aspects that are more complex, right? Like I think there's like more of a way to like pursue like specific builds, and like there's more like meta gaming in Borderlands, right? Because you can control more aspects of it, and you can like there are like target weapons. There's like target loot, right? Like, um, uh, but I see your point, right? Like I see like there is an adaptability aspect that you don't have in Borderlands, right? That you have in RoboQuest because you are kind of dealt with given the hand you're dealt.
I also think that part of this is just like a increase in like the ability of tech, right?
Sure.
Obviously, something like Doom is very tech gated, because it's the early '90s, right? You working with a handful of guys. You don't have 1,000 people who can put together this like intricately crafted, like experience, right? But for instance, actually, Baldur's Gate would be a pretty good example of sort of the opposite case of this, right? Which is that it handles things just raw and at scale, in my opinion. I think we would probably both agree that Baldur's Gate is such a good experience um, that it doesn't need it doesn't need to sort of chase that possibility space high that like roguelikes can give you. And I would probably say that for most anything that's really trying to kind of like tell a story, or where narrative is a big focus, you really can't do this. I don't know that you could really have like a good narrative roguelike. Like I'm sure people will try and have tried.
Hades.
And I know, yeah, exactly. I was like, I know people really love like Hades, but I don't know that I think
It
whatever.
parcels out the story over different runs, right? Like it's I will agree with you.
So yeah, so the thing, okay, right. So my thing with Hades is that I don't think the story in Hades is procedurally generated. This is the
right.
distinction I'm
Yes. Yeah.
trying. Yeah, the story in Hades, or the progression of Hades is procedurally generated, but the story of Hades is this kind of carefully crafted thing. It's not like somebody is making what are they? Are they called like radiant quests in like Oblivion? Do you know what I'm talking
Yeah,
about?
yeah, the Radiant quest system. Like, yeah, nobody's making procedurally generated quests that have like deep story implications and trying to
Yeah,
like.
and nobody is looking at those quests and going, "Wow, this is so good. This is like a like everybody looks at those quests and goes, "Wow, these are cookie cutter bullshit," right? Like I'm not interested, basically, right?
Yeah,
Um, and so, but yeah, I don't know. Outside of that, I think that people are looking at games a little more in this like possibility space way rather than like I think that when people look at stuff like the Renaissance, like the mid 2000s Renaissance. You know, you had Deus Ex, you had Dishonored, you had Mass Effect. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago. Um, I think one of the reasons that those games don't hit in the same way that they do now is because they fail on the level of this sort of like possibility space. Mass Effect 2, I love Mass Effect 2. That is a great game. But like the thing about that game that is so transcendently good, in my opinion, is the story, the characters, right? The action, you know, like all of that stuff. It is like really like well done. But I feel like if Mass Effect 2 came out today, people wouldn't like it as much as we all loved it in 2010. Do you know what I mean?
yeah, yeah. Um,
Have we ever done a Mass Effect 2 episode?
I don't think so. That's the only one I finished.
It's the only one you finished? Wow. Yeah.
Because like I played Mass Effect 2 on release, and I
hmm
never got to 3, and I think I went back to 1 to start to try and do a trilogy run, and I just never finished it.
I
Um,
did I did most of a trilogy run. I beat 1 and 2, but I didn't do 3 in the legendary edition when it came out.
yeah.
Um it's so good. Mass Effect 2 is so fucking good.
See, I mean, I enjoyed it a lot, but like I was also kind of taken aback because it felt like the whole game was gather the party, um, and then like
Yeah.
you had a little bit of like the actual like a very little bit of actual quest at the end.
Yeah,
Um,
that's the thing that I love about it, right? You know, is that it's all character. It's all character driven stuff. And you know, you have this like loop thread or whatever. But there's also all of these like little like subplots and vignettes to play out. God, what a good game! I love that game. I was having a conversation with with some friends of mine about Dragon Age Inquisition. You remember Dragon Age Inquisition?
I played it for like 3 hours total, but yes,
Yeah, that was the game of the year. That was the Game Award, the game of the year, 2016. Um, and everybody loved it, right? Like it was incredibly well reviewed. It had like a lot of what, but it's sort of like Avatar in that it kind of didn't leave enough of a like a cultural footprint. And I feel like if I told people the game of the year in 2016, it might have been 2015. I don't remember the year. Um, the game of the year in 2015 is Dragon Age Inquisition. People would be like, oh my god, I haven't thought about that game in 6 years. You know,
yeah. I mean, it's interesting because like I think there was an aspect of it that was kind of like I think there were people at the time that were complaining about it, and I think this is one of those things that like in the rearview mirror people are like it was never good, right? Like that like uh they like that like there's I think it's I think the people who now say it was never good are the same people who didn't think it was good when it was released. So I don't want to call them revisionists, but I think that like kind of attitude has kind of seeped into um the kind of the cultural consensus that Dragon Age Inquisition was actually not very good, um, uh,
yeah.
which is interesting. Um, yeah, what was I'm sorry, what was your point with that? Because I think I forgot.
I was just thinking about that as being kind of you know, on the cusp of sort of this like decline in this sort of game, right? These like big expansive, you know, like Starfield would maybe be another good example of this, right? We basically just got a new Bethesda RPG, and to be fair, you know, Starfield sold a gazillion copies. It's like the second, I think, most you know, played game, or not played, but like bought game on Steam last year. They released a bunch of statistics for like this stuff, second or third or something like that. You know, um, but
I don't, I
I
don't
feel like if if you were to tell me that like Starfield was, the best game of 2023, I think a lot of people would really disagree with that.
Yeah, but part of that's that we all there was a pretty banger year, right? Like, I don't. I think Starfield has its problems that are outside of, um, like I think you're picking essentially a weak example there,
What's the
right?
difference between Starfield and Baldur's Gate 3? Would maybe be a good Steelman counter argument,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
What I'm saying? Yeah.
yeah,
Okay. That is fair enough. I suppose. Um,
yeah.
but yeah.
No, but like I think you're. I'm not trying to fight too hard against your underlying supposition. This is like, to my mind though, the roguelite bit of it is a way to kind of. I don't see like a big AAA roguelite like doing gangbusters anytime soon. Like, I feel like this is like a thing that works for smaller, cheaper games because you don't expect it to be like this big. Like, there's been one AAA roguelite. It's that PlayStation 5 exclusive or time exclusive. I forget the name, like the name of it. Yes, 5 roguelike. Um, exclusive maybe. Sorry, this is how much I don't remember it.
Mhm.
Anyway, it was uh it was a big exclusive, and it was super high profile, and it was kind of like Returnal. That's the name of it. Um, right? Like, do you remember Returnal?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's it's kind of like whatever, right? Like,
Oh, it's on Steam. Look at that.
yeah, yeah. It came to Steam eventually. Um,
Yeah.
but I think it's kind of like roguelike, like full roguelike stuff is kind of like relegated to the kind of like the below AAA space, right? Like, I think the highest tier, very prominent game is something like Remnant from the Ashes 2. It also came out this year. Um, or like Hades, which is like a premium indie, maybe is the best way to put that. Um, God, that's a weird thing to say, but I think that's correct. We can blend a little bit into the back half here. What do you think of that idea, like, of premium indies, right? Like,
I call these AA titles. I think they're real, right? Like Fall Guys is a pretty good example of one.
I feel like double A is something different though, right? Like, double A to me is something like Eurojank that still gets a wide release, right? Like Witcher 2, or like, um, maybe like the original Deus Ex, um, but maybe I don't know. I feel like there's a difference between like a downgraded triple, like a not quite triple A mainstream title, and like a high level indie.
Okay,
Um,
that's interesting. So you would maybe say that, for instance, XCOM Chimera Squad would be a AA game, right? It is a
yes,
small game from a AAA studio
I might even say
that
that
doesn't get
XCOM
like
is a
the
double A game, right? Like, cause like
XCOM 2 was huge, right? Like I feel like that was like a massive game,
um,
right?
I don't really know, right? Like, it doesn't have the polish of a triple A game, right? Like um, and like, I don't
Hmm.
think a double A, like, I don't think it's quite sized, because sometimes games hit different, like, Anthem, I would call a triple A game, even though it ultimately failed, right? Like, you
Hmm.
um, right? Like, and this is more definition nonsense, right? Because, like, I mentioned Dave the Diver earlier, right? Like, I would maybe call that a premium indie, but it's not actually an indie game, right? Like, it's like the pet project of a large. It's like a small project of a large studio, but like it's still ultimately kind of like a not really indie, because it's like got the backing of a major.
Yeah, I would maybe call that Dave the Diver. I just think that there's I think that there's a level of indie plus where you get when I think of indie, I'm thinking small teams,
Right.
small budgets, small scope, right? Um, you know, Grime, Estrella, these are successful games, right? But like at the end of the day, these are games that are making, you know, money off of the fact that it was developed by a couple of people, like a few folks,
Sure.
right? Um,
But does
uh,
Supergiant count anymore then?
how big is Supergiant right now? Maybe
Supergiant's
not.
small, but it's basically Supergiant's like funded off of its own success, right? But like
I
it's
would say Supergiant is still an indie game. Yes. 26 employees
okay.
is what I'm seeing. But for instance, what's the Ori and the Blind Forest? Do you know what those guys are called?
I forget the name, but it's Microsoft Studios or something. Like it's like
Yeah.
Microsoft Indie
Ori
Studio.
and the Will of the Wisps, I think would be like a double A game. That was like 80 people, I
Okay.
think, worked on that game, right? And as you get like to me, that's just like a scale thing. 8 people, 26 people, these are pretty small numbers, right? And that like satisfies sort of this like level of kind of like indie, in my opinion. But when you get to 80, 100, Fall Guys was 100 people or whatever, like when you have a 100-person development team, that's a triple A game or a double A game, right? Um, and when you have 100 plus, and all of this other sort of stuff, that's like a triple A game. Part of this is maybe this is just like me coming from, I work in indies and I have
Sure.
my own sort of like a view on this stuff.
Right.
Like internally, like I think other people may like another argument along like the indie spectrum is like, have you ever heard the system is what it does? Do you know what that is? It's just
Yeah.
like people use this in like politics for dumb
Yeah, yeah.
reasons, but
Right,
it's an
right.
interesting philosophical thing where it says where basically intentions don't matter,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
What matters is the thing. The thing is what it does, right? And in this sense, you might say the product is what it does, right? Like a um Hades and Ori and the Will of the Wisps are indie games because they seem like indie games, right? They look like a lot of other indie games look like. Who cares how many people made them? 1,000 people could have made this stupid fucking game, but like the point is that you sell it for $20. It's very artsy and creative and an ultimately scoped down experience that you probably built to get to the bottom of in 6 to 8 hours. And you pay $20 for it instead of 60. That's an indie, right? Like I would entertain that as like a valid argument.
Yeah.
This
So
thing is an indie.
yeah. So in that kind of vein, I guess that makes sense because it's kind of like it doesn't matter how you get there, right? Like Dave the
Mm.
Diver had like polish and money and runway by virtue of being a subsidiary of a large company. Super like Hades had polish and time and runway by virtue of the success of Bastion and the other Supergiant previous games. And Hades 2 is going
Yep.
to have that, but the success of Hades, even though, Dave the Diver is like developed by a small core team but had the support of like a huge organization, whereas Supergiant will still only have 26-ish people.
Yeah, and also, like honestly, the funny thing about indie is that traditionally it refers to games coming from not publishers. But now you have companies like mine that are indie games publishers,
Publishers,
which
right?
is like an oxymoron, right? Like, how does an independent game have a publisher? That's not supposed to happen, right? But like obviously we define these things in different sorts,
Yeah,
in different
yeah,
sorts
yeah.
of ways.
Um, yeah, no, absolutely.
Anyway,
Yeah,
yeah. If you're asking me, in my opinion is that it's about sort of like team size and sort of like
yeah.
game lengths.
But so I guess maybe on like, do you do you think there's a real difference in type between something like, and not to pick on it, but something like Gone Viral and like Hades, right? Like in like because I feel like there's like a level of polish there that like the Gone Viral guys just like couldn't get to because like they can't work on it for a year without caring about cost, right?
I do think that matters, in the sense that I think polish tends toward AAA. Like, when I talk about indification, one of the things about indies is that people don't expect indies to be as polished as AAA games, which is actually very important because one of the ways that AAA games get so expensive is through the polishing process, right?
Right.
Um, you talk about something like Diablo 4 would probably be a good example of it. The QA team on Diablo 4 is probably like gigantic,
Yeah.
because there's just a lot of stuff that you need to test when you get to that level. And that level of testing requires that level of fixing, requires that, generates that level of polish, right? And if Diablo 4 had released with just like dumb bugs all the time, people would have clowned on it in the same way that they clowned on any other AAA game like Mass Effect Andromeda or any Bethesda game on release, really, or anything kind of along those sorts of lines. When indie games have bugs, it tends to just be a matter of course thing that people expect, and you put out bug fix patches and all that kind of stuff. A common refrain that people have about indies is they're just an indie studio. They need our help, reporting bugs. It's
Right, like
like,
it's like the meme about Blizzard's just an indie studio, right? Like that's why there are bugs
exactly.
in
I mean,
WoW, right? Yeah, but that's
yeah,
why it's a
like that
meme.
meme has its source in the way that
Yeah,
people talk about indie
right.
games, right? Or even the way that, like, something we obviously do QA testing. Um, but like I can't test for every piece of hardware that
Sure.
everybody like has or whatever. And so just a natural thing that's going to happen when a thing releases is that a million bugs are going to crop up because, well, when you play on a 66 hertz monitor with this kind of mouse with this kind of keyboard, your input delay spikes through the roof, and now all of a sudden your
Or
inputs are all delayed by 2 seconds or something.
what was the name of that like platform you guys put out?
Finch, you're gonna talk about
Finch,
Finch?
Finch, right?
Yeah,
Because I sent you like a bug report, and you were like, "What? This is so slow because of like a like." Essentially, I was playing
yeah.
like slow mo motion because of some refresh rate issue
It
or
was
something.
it was a refresh rate issue, right? The game's FPS was tied to the refresh rate of your monitor. It still is tied to the refresh rate of your monitor, actually, to be quite honest. So anyway, yeah, that's sort of my thinking when it comes to stuff.
Yeah, no, interesting. Well, we've talked for like an hour and 20 minutes. How was your week?
How was my week? I played a lot. I've just been playing so much World of Warcraft, because I don't know. I've just gotten into like alts. Last week I filled out the box on 4 alts. This week I have done. I filled out the box on 3 and done a little bit more on one more. I don't know that I'm actually gonna like try and keep up characters. Who can never be sure, but that's a lot of like what I have been materially playing when it comes to sort of the day by day. But the interesting thing that I wanted to talk about was, do you know the game Axis and Allies, right?
Yeah,
Okay. I saw a YouTube video that got pushed to me by YouTube, and I was like, what the fuck is this? And honestly, it was just the most what the fuck is this that I had to like look into it. It was a round by round YouTube recap of the Axis and Allies World Championship by the YouTube channel Board Game Nation, which has less than 10,000 subscribers. It's like, why the fuck is this coming to
An
me?
opportunity.
You know what I mean? But the
you know,
video had 100.
you know what's crazy? Somebody I know that you don't know sent me this video yesterday.
About it because I wanted to, because I felt like this was your shit. Yeah, it is truly. There are 2 of them so far. These guys won the championship at Axis and Allies, or at Gen Con 2023 for Axis and Allies, and they are doing a play-by-play recreation how they won that championship. And I got it. It's like the first summoning solve video I ever watched. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
Where it's just like watching someone who is really good at a thing that you don't comprehend explain it in a way that isn't incomprehensible, but also doesn't condescend to you is actually really satisfying. Um,
I think
and
you. I
so yeah,
think
it's
you discover. I don't know if your dad was like this, but like, I think this is why my dad liked watching woodworking shows, even though he doesn't do a ton of woodworking. Um, frankly, that's something that I started doing is watching woodworking shows on YouTube, for like similar reasons. But like, I think there's definitely something there. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, we need to play Axis and Allies now. I'm getting like addicted to these Axis and Allies videos. I've watched a million of them at this point. There's an online version of Axis and Allies I learned, right? Like Risk or something like that, or like Settlers of Catan. Like there are the online kind of like versions of those games. There is an Axis and Allies 1942, which is the edition that allows like for Axis and Allies. It's not the edition. I have an Axis and Allies back there, but it is not that edition. My Axis and Allies, I think, like the Avalon Hill revised edition. There's honestly so many of these. Axis and Allies was created by like a studio. They went bankrupt. The rights got taken over by Avalon Hill, which is or I'm sorry, by Milton Bradley, which is a board game company. Right? We all know like Milton Bradley. They sold the rights to another company called Avalon Hill, which another high end, you know, board game maker, and then they sold the rights to. I'm sorry, God, is it like God, who owns Axis and Allies right now? It's like the famous people that everybody
Rio Grande,
that make a million. Um, because they
Renegade Game.
also own.
It says
Yes,
as of
Renegade Game Studios.
as of last year, it's Renegade Game Studios.
Okay, yeah. Renegade Game Studios is they own like Diplomacy, right? Just like a million other of these like fucking board games. But anyway, so I don't know. I've just been getting into Axis and Allies, and I kind of secretly fucking want to. I guess I want to now go, like play Axis and Allies 1942 online, which I think will kill me if I do this. Am I really just becoming this guy? Am I becoming like a weird Axis and Allies like board game geek guy?
See, the funny thing is the person who sent this to me was a friend who knows about my adventures with with like miniatures, historical miniatures war gamers.
Yeah, this is exactly why I wanted to bring it up.
So like I've basically leapfrogged over Axis and Allies, right? Like I've played like I have never actually played Axis and Allies itself. I have played I played like Napoleon in Europe and a couple other, or like I think even maybe something like Scythe falls into this kind of category. Historical miniatures is like no board, custom armies, right? Like printed. It's like Warhammer, but with history instead of like Space Marines.
Yeah, that is definitely. It feels like the like the way that you leapfrog civilization when you play Europa Universalis. It's the same sort of
Yeah,
principle.
yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. But yeah, um, yeah, interesting. It is. I wonder why that got pushed to people. It must have gotten like pushed to like people in with like our same kind of interests, right? Like,
Yeah, I really do honestly not have I don't have a great answer for this. I like when I think about my history, like my YouTube video watching well now it's all Axis and Allies. I've watched a million of these, but it's like what was I watching right before I watched the first video? Honestly, yeah, this is all like my normal shit. There's like not all that much yeah, I don't know. I think it just got pushed to us because like
yeah, no, I mean it's interesting because it didn't get directly pushed to me, but it got pushed to somebody who was like, um, basically, he'd be obviously he's a friend of a friend because he's got me as a mutual person, but like somebody who I know
right.
like is into the same kind of things, but isn't directly connected at
I
all.
almost wonder if it's like Warhammer stuff because like Total
Oh,
War
you know what?
Warhammer
Yeah,
is adjacent to Warhammer, is adjacent to board games,
the
is
guy who
adjacent to
the guy
Axis
who
and
sent it
Allies.
to me is a big 40K player. Like he
Okay,
plays 40K
yeah.
with friend of the cast Mark, which is how I know him.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, I understand. Yeah, I like I obviously keep up with Warhammer because of Total War, right?
Right.
And a lot of the channels that cover Total War news also cover like just regular ass Warhammer news, especially because they're bringing back the old world, right? They have Warhammer the old.
Wait, yeah, have
And you
they?
know what? I had watched a show match because they did a sort of Total War or not Total War, Warhammer the Old World show match on the Warhammer channel. I bet like that's like the connecting tissue.
That makes sense. Yeah. On my end, uh, we talked about most of the games I played this week, so I don't have to go over all of them. But it is funny. We talked about XCOM. We talked about XCOM Chimera Squad. I played what might be the last in this style of game, Midnight Suns. Um,
Oh, sure. Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
The
yeah,
2K game.
yeah. Which is super fun. It's the dialogue's kind of cringy. Um, it's weird. It's weird in the same way. There was another game I played like this where it's like Marvel characters that are definitely not the movie versions, but kind of are in a way. Like clearly influenced by the movie. Like you know, Doctor Strange is he is not as straight man as you describe him in the comics, but he's kind of like almost like I hate to make this comparison, but I think it's the best thing that comes to mind is he's kind of like Sheldon in Big Bang Theory, right? Like he's like that level of kind of like like I'm a nerd
Okay.
kind of personality. Tony Stark is fairly, but like he is fairly Tony Stark, but like I feel like that's a little bit more universal across the two. Um, and I don't know the other characters well enough. I've only based on there's your custom character Hunter. There's Captain Marvel, who I hate. I just like hate this version of the character. But and I don't think I don't think it's very much like the movie version at all. There's Blade, who I like. There's two versions of Ghost Rider, although I've only gotten to play with one so far. And then like do you know anything about the Midnight Suns, like the superhero group?
I think I know. Okay. The vague thing I know about the Midnight Suns is they fight magic enemies. Because someone once described the Midnight Suns to me as a counter to Shadow Pact, which is the DC Universe version of this. They are a super team of, in the DC Universe, they're no-name heroes really.
And
Whose whole thing is they like fight the magic bad guys in the DC Universe.
okay, so I don't know what they are in the mainline Marvel universe, but in the game it's Blade, Magic with a K. I don't know what Nico's hero name is, and
Oh my god, I know is from with the staff.
yes,
And wow, she's from Runaways. Yeah, I know.
yes, yeah. And
I love Runaway. Runaways was like the greatest comic when I was a kid, or when I was a teenager, I guess.
And last one is the Jamie Reyes. I think it's Jamie Reyes. The
Fuck
younger
it.
Ghost Rider, the hot rod Ghost Rider, as opposed to the motorcycle Ghost Rider.
They named a guy. That's the name of Blue Beetle.
Maybe I must have the name wrong.
I mean, I do know that there is like there's Rider because there's obviously Johnny Blaze.
I am probably just being racist.
Danny Ketch is another one. Robbie Reyes.
Okay, so I wasn't that far off.
Okay, you are not that far off. Yeah, true.
So I feel less bad.
Okay.
But yeah, no. Those are the four, and then Caretaker is like Lilith's sister. I don't know how much these characters are real or just for the game, but it's neat. There's some like weird like interface things because like you have like this thing where you're like driving characters around an open world instead of just like, and like the tactical screen is like you don't do a ton of movement on your own, but it's funny because it's like Firaxis doesn't make like games where you drive people around, so things are like just slightly off, like the facial animations aren't quite right, and like you kind of slide around as you're walking around a little bit, but it's not terrible, it's just funny. But the core gameplay is pretty fun, right? Like it's kind of sort of a deck builder. Each character gets 8 cards. You draw them into a hand. You can play like 3 per turn with some like caveats, of course. But I'm enjoying it, and the playing toys with the superheroes is pretty good. So I give that one a thumbs up on my like easily digestible story. Easily digestible stuff. Probably the best Marvel experience I've had in a while.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, fair enough.
Yeah. But yeah. Man, is there another one of those movies that we have to watch soon? I don't.
Rebel Moon is the Zack Snyder movie that I do want to talk about. We could maybe do
No,
it.
I mean I'm in a Marvel movie.
Oh, in a Marvel movie? What is it? What is the next Marvel?
Because they had to like de-kang the universe. Because Jonathan Majors got convicted of domestic abuse, right?
2024 Marvel movies.
Echo Season 1, which is out apparently. Deadpool 3 in the summer.
Yeah. Wow. Okay.
There's an Ironheart. Damn it. I,
Venom 3. Look at that.
oh, right.
Yeah. So I do know about.
Oh,
I
Madam
do know about
Web.
some. Yeah.
When does that fucking thing come out?
That's soon. I think it's in February, right? Yeah. It's Valentine's Day.
Oh, Christ.
Maybe the dumbest looking movie.
Is it?
Like these.
Are we going to get like Morbius level meme value out of it? Because if we do, it might be
I
okay.
don't think you can't ever match Morbius level meme value, but it is gonna be probably pretty simple. Madam Web is like such a fucking tangential, like they are mining so deep into the Spider-Man IP that Sony has the rights to make these stupid fucking movies. But yeah, I do know that there's issues because uh the there's been an issue with Captain America New World Order, I think is what the next movie is called. Captain
Brave
America
New World.
4, which is Brave New World. Okay. Is got delayed. And then also Blade has been in development hell. I think they threw the whole script out on Blade. So I think those were like the movies that were supposed to like come here, basically. So yeah.
Yeah. What is Armor Wars?
Oh, Armor Wars is the. It's the Rhodey movie. It is
Okay.
the War Machine movie that is probably going to feature like Crimson Dynamo and a couple of other like Iron Man has like a million villains who are all like I have my own suit of armor, but evil. And people assume that Armor Wars is basically going to be that, right?
Okay.
Like yeah.
What's the mentor character from like the old Teen Titans? Like Red Cyclone or something? I
Oh,
know
Red
it's
Tornado. Yeah.
Red Tornado. Okay. Obviously that's
Mhm.
DC,
From Young
but
Justice actually is what you're
Young
thinking, but yeah.
Justice. Was it Young Justice? I thought it
Mhm.
was. Okay. Whatever. I don't remember. Been my brain hurts. I don't want to remember all this nonsense, buddy.
We need to see the new Young Justice season. It came out. I never watched it because I'm a huge loser.
Then I need to watch Loki 2. Oh,
Yeah.
other thing. Last thing, maybe to close this out.
Okay. Sure.
Yeah. We talked a little bit about this beforehand, but I watched the first 4 episodes of The Sopranos finally.
I'm so excited for
Yeah,
you to
it
watch
is.
all of The Sopranos.
I am too. It's gonna be a little bit slow going because I'm watching with my girlfriend. But I'm hooked. I am like so in. Um, there was like I think it was hooked the moment that Tony walks down his driveway and opens the Star Ledger. And I was like, it's like Leonardo DiCaprio was like, I know that. There's like a level of personal connection to like kind of like I am ethnically Italian American. There's a lot of stuff I identify with in there. That just feels very appropriate. I'm family's not mob affiliated. I guess just to get that out there. But um
The FBI informant like takes off his headset, throws it down. God damn it! I listened to 300 episodes of this podcast. This guy won't shut up about Zack Snyder, and it was all for nothing. I'm sorry. Okay.
no, it's just good.
Do you have any favorite characters so far
Um
in Sopranos?
uh uh Big Pussy. Uh
Okay. Yeah.
yeah, just so far. It's not like the surrounding characters don't have enough happening with them for you to like really like most of the main characters have flaws that are very kind of visible, right? So I think it's easier to like kind of like the side characters because they're not super developed yet. Like like who's the one that steals the mocha pies? That Silvio or Polly? I forget which. Um, from
I don't know. Silvio is my favorite of
okay,
like the crew.
yeah. No, I mean I've been you know I've just kind of been enjoying the dynamic. I like Artie too, but the thing is like when Artie got introduced, I'm like, oh, that's the guy from the screenshot. That I don't understand the context for. Uh, but it's like him holding a sniper rifle, but like the uh the caption is like the caption is like from like the real world, right? Like it's like the caption is like say based again, right? Like
Yeah, yeah. Artie is also pretty great. Yeah. A lot of people love Paulie. I honestly just think that because he is like the biggest and most kind of dynamic of them, but I don't know. Silvio, I think, is the most interesting of sort of the side. Actually, that's not true. I guess I would say Christopher is the most interesting of the side characters, but like, yeah, I don't know. I don't want to say too much
yeah,
without
yeah.
spoiling anything, obviously. But Silvio is my favorite. Is what I
No,
wanna is
I
what I wanna put down.
I would say I like the side characters so far. Just because it's like I said, they're easy to not hate yet. Also, I just
Yep.
kind of wonder about like some of the like, it's like obviously this is kind of like height of HBO. It's like, oh, the strippers, they have their tops off, right? And then the second episode, they all have their tops on, and then in the third episode, they all have their tops off again. I'm like, I wonder like what the reason is for that. Like, do they get paid extra when they go topless for an episode or something?
It might have been like a remnant of like a pilot thing. You know what I mean? Like, because the pilot is the first episode, but you shoot a pilot and then you give the pilot to the show,
Sure.
or I'm sorry, to the distributor, and they make the decision or whatever, so they could cut. Like I don't know, something like that, right?
Yeah, but
But
but it's
I also
it's
don't have the
weird because
answer.
like I said in like the third and the fourth episode, they had their tops off again. Uh, not it's not a huge deal, but um, but yeah, no, I've been enjoying it. And I'm excited to see more of it.
Good. Yeah, we'll fucking talk about it, man. There's like some moments in The Sopranos that are so good. It actually kind of blows my mind, like how smart that show can get sometimes. I don't want to say that it's I think there's a really interesting conversation to be had. We will probably do a podcast along something along these lines of Sopranos, Breaking Bad, uh, like Better Call Saul, Ozark is probably in here. I'm trying to think like what are like the crime
The Wire.
dramas. Yeah. Wire. Interesting. Yeah, The Wire. Yeah, The Wire could go in there. I feel like there's like a million of these or whatever. Um, and I don't know. Sopranos is very interesting. The Sopranos does a thing. Remind me like later when we're talking about The Sopranos to explain what I'm talking about here. The Sopranos does a thing that most other TV is too chicken shit to do. Okay? Most other showrunners are fucking cowards, okay? But The Sopranos is like it's like mind-blowing stuff. This is like the stuff that makes me love the Venture, right? It's like the same stuff that makes me love The Sopranos. And honestly, I hate it because everybody who likes The Sopranos likes Sopranos because they like dumb surface level crime drama bullshit. But the most interesting stuff happening in The Sopranos is all happening in right? Like it's like Breaking Bad fans who hate Skyler, like that level of like, oh my fucking kill me. Like you guys are all missing the point. Which does say the crime drama stuff isn't interesting, but like the stuff that makes The Sopranos good is the stuff happening in Dr. Mel.
That makes sense. I feel that. I mean, there is a personal thing there that I won't go into here that like definitely came up for me during even those first four episodes. Yeah. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. Um,
Okay.
yeah.
Well,
I
I
mean,
guess that's
unless you've
it.
got anything to say about apparently fucking Rorschach's been making the rounds on X.
Oh my god. I knew you were gonna bring that up. I don't have a lot to say. You asked a question that I was like, I'll answer this on the podcast. You asked a question. What is it? It was like,
It was something like Alan Moore was mad because he got dicked over or something. Uh,
yes, I do think Alan Moore is forever. This is the question. I maintain that 90% of what Alan Moore says about superheroes is due to sour grapes over what he perceives to be a hard dicking from DC, and in a world where it treats him better, one Superman fan. I agree. I fundamentally agree with the sentiment. I think that this is absolutely true. I frankly think that Alan Moore is somewhere between a shitposter and a poser, depending on how seriously you take him and his political beliefs. Um, like it is very funny to me that the guy who whose stated political position seems to be. I actually have lost a lot of respect for Alan Moore in just like the last couple of years, to be quite honest with you. A guy whose stated political position seems to be anarchy is good, sort of V for Vendetta, right? Um, the big thing that fuels him in life is a deeply capitalistic sort of market focused thing of he got fucked over by this corporation due to like bullshit in the contract because they keep reprinting Watchmen, which is why he doesn't get the rights back to it. As long as they keep printing it, they keep extending the rights, and Watchmen is such a hugely popular comic that they just have kept reprinting it indefinitely because it's the best comic ever made. Everybody loves it, right? Um, I think all of that is like fundamentally true. I think most of Alan Moore's best stuff is in that period. V for Vendetta is actually a very good book, even though the very end of it sucks super bad and its politics are super dumb. The real thing that Alan Moore sucks for is From Hell, which is where he purports a truly bonkers conspiracy theory around the Jack the Ripper murder, which is deeply untrue and so dumb, and I cannot believe anybody actually believes it. But theoretically speaking, he could just be shitposting. He should post a lot. So depending on how seriously and earnestly you take Alan Moore, he can be a genius, but he's also a fucking moron. Okay.
I feel like my what's it called? Libertarian adjacent honor requires me to specify that he's, I assume, an anarcho-communist rather than an anarcho-capitalist.
Yes, he is an anarcho. Yeah. He is communist.
But yeah, no, it's because like this thing I've been seeing is like, Rorschach's supposed to be basically Steve Ditko Randian parody essentially. This is a funny thing because like
but by the way, that's also not true. Whatever, it's fine.
And we can go into this. So this very surface level thing, because I am not super familiar with Steve Ditko or whatnot, but like,
yeah,
is like, this is kind of a thing that happens occasionally, like a lot actually, where like, the supposed bad kind of conservative-ish guy ends up being like a fan favorite that everybody loves, which is like, Alec Baldwin's character in 30 Rock and Ron Swanson, right? Like, and so I feel like Rorschach's kind of in that vein. Obviously, a lot less friendly and cuddly than
yeah, the reason Rorschach is bad in Watchmen is because Watchmen is telling like is basically making the point that morality on the scale of superheroes is way more nuanced and complicated than the simplistic view that this guy has. Right. This is why Rorschach, we would probably think of him in like an antagonist. This is why he has to die at the end, right? He is too politically naive and simple-minded, even if he is convicted, right? To exist in a world this nuanced and complex, right? Like this is kind of his purpose, right? What I think it happens is people respect the conviction, right? This is what makes him a good character. I don't even think he's a villain. I don't think he's even really all that like like wrong is kind of even a bad frame to it, right? The thing that Watchmen is doing is saying, see, here is how incredibly nuanced and complicated morality gets when you are thinking in terms of superheroes and supervillains, and the guy who has the I just punch the bad guys real good is can't exist in this world, right? This is like the sum total of his point. I think that all of the other shit that comes out of this is apocryphal and cope. I hate the Steve Ditko thing because there's no evidence for it and it's super dumb. It's basically just somebody's fucking fan fiction. And I also sort of hate the weird politicization of some of this stuff because like, man, like you're trying to map a character from 50 fucking years ago onto like contemporary politics. It's not gonna work, right? You know what I mean?
No,
I don't know. Like I hate all this stuff. It's really what I'm saying.
I think there's like, and maybe this is why Alan Moore gets mad. There's a level of kind of like, when faced with like, killing millions of innocents to potentially, stop like, a conceived problem in the future, most people are like, no, that's incorrect, right? Like the kind of like gut reaction for most of the audience is like, no, that's incorrect, and Rorschach is the hero for trying to stand up to that, right? Like even regardless of like kind of the other piece of it. And I think that's why I don't know what Alan Moore wanted, right? I'm not gonna pretend to, but his stated things on the paper are that's the incorrect interpretation. But like,
Yeah, right. But and this is why I'm saying it is about it's about nuance versus simplicity, right?
Right.
The thing that people are railing against, the thing that people get hung up on when it comes to Rorschach is they think because he has, right-wing beliefs, this is what Alan Moore is making a point about essentially right-wingers,
Right.
right? It's not the case. You can also have simplistic beliefs as a left-wing
Sure.
person,
Yeah.
right? It just so happens the axis that Rorschach is being evaluated on is simplicity versus complexity, like nuance, basically. Um, and Rorschach is also tragic in that way, right? Like I said, his conviction, people respect him for his conviction.
Sure.
That's real, and that does come across in the comic, right? I think that people think of Rorschach's death as a tragic death, right? Probably the most empathetic character in that whole series is Night Owl. And he breaks down at Rorschach's death because even though he doesn't morally agree with Rorschach, Rorschach is still his friend who he cares about, and his death is tragic, right? Alan Moore has said a lot of stuff about like Rorschach in past that, but frankly, I think he's a little bit like Zack Snyder or like Steve Denuser would be other good examples of this. Just like people who say things that get wildly misinterpreted after the fact because it fits people's post hoc justifications
Sure.
for their frankly dog shit view on media. So there we
Sure.
go.
No, that's interesting. I don't know. Maybe I'm due for a Watchmen reread.
Honestly, yeah, maybe me too. Honestly, this just makes me want to watch the movie again. To
Yeah,
be
no, I
honest,
mean, I like the movie too. I like the movie a lot when we rewatched it for the cast.
yeah.
Um, I would maybe do like a rewatch and re-talk about that. That could be a thing that I could be into.
Okay. No, fuck yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Honestly, we could do the HBO series again, which you and I both
Uh,
did not like
I was
because
gonna
the ending
say,
sucks.
well, part of my fundamental thing, and I've kept this through like I have not read any of kind of like the DC's after Watchmen stuff. I think the reason that Watchmen is so good is because it's left ambiguous as to whether or not Rorschach's journal actually reaches the publisher, and as soon as you answer that question, like it totally recontextualizes the original book in a way that kind of like has to diminish it in order for a future series to move forward. So
Yeah. Yep.
and so I'm not to say that any of that is necessarily invalid. I didn't like after Watchmen, like we talked about it ended poorly. I personally think that they did not do a good job with Doctor
Yeah, Dr. Manhattan.
yeah.
I loved the Hooded Justice episode. Oh, man, I loved that episode. I thought that was the smartest shit. It was so good. I'm honestly like still mad about it.
uh, I don't
I'm
know.
really I maybe will rewatch the HBO show. Is it
Yeah,
not on Max anymore? Didn't it get pulled off of
I
Max?
don't
Man, I'm
know.
gonna be fucking pissed.
I know. I did not particularly like um uh the kind of recharacterization of of him, but whatever. That's all fine. Um
Okay. Okay. Well, I think that's it.
yeah.
We can
All
we
right.
can get into some of this stuff later.
If you would like to email us about any things that we've talked about on this podcast, email us at derpsgames@gmail.com or podcast@derpsgames.com. You can follow us at twitch.tv/derpsgames or youtube.com/derpsgames where these go out live. Rate, review us wherever you find podcasts. All the links are down in the description. Buddy, you have anything you're looking to promote?
Next week. Next week. Yeah, wow, Jesus Christ. Next week is Grime comes to the Nintendo Switch. The final update for Grime. Grime the Definitive Edition lands on Nintendo Switch, PlayStation, Xbox. It would have come to Stadia, I'm sure, if Stadia existed still. So yeah, I'm very excited.
All right.
I don't know. Yeah.
Since you have said that, I should probably mention that I work for Google. They do not endorse this podcast in any way, shape, or form.
Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot about that.
I'm supposed to.
Yeah.
I don't know anything about Stadia, but I'm also probably not supposed to talk about it. So,
Sure.
no official comment from me on Stadia stuff. Yeah. Well, with that, I'm going to say until next time, dear listeners.
Until next time, loyal listeners.